War stories often paint soldiers as brothers in arms, comrades who return home with the same haunted eyes, the same burdens. But what happens when two soldiers from the same army, the same war, can barely recognize each other's experiences? This is the story of two German soldiers who wore the same uniform, saluted the same flag, and fought for the same cause, yet lived through two entirely different wars. One fought the Western Allies in the ruined towns and hedgerows of France, the other was swallowed by the vast, frozen wastelands of the Soviet Union. When the war ended, they both returned to a shattered Germany, but when they sat across from each other, they realized they shared little more than a language. Because for them, and for countless other German soldiers, World War II wasn't one war. It was two separate nightmares unfolding at the same time on opposite ends of the continent. On one side, a brutal campaign of survival against the Red Army on the Eastern Front, where ideology, starvation, and annihilation ruled. On the other, the slow retreat across the familiar fields of Western Europe, facing an enemy who still played by some rules of war. This is the untold divide between two soldiers who never could, and maybe never would, fully relate to each other. In the early days of the war, a young German recruit might have imagined a campaign that resembled his father's war. A war fought along the borders of Belgium or France, trenches cutting through rolling hills, artillery pounding enemy lines. A war of maneuvers, stalemates, and occasional moments where two exhausted armies, locked in mutual destruction, recognized each other's humanity across no man's land. For some, this illusion lasted well into 1940. During the Blitzkrieg through France, German tanks rolled past villages that seemed barely changed since the Great War. French farmers stood silently on the roadsides, watching as columns of panzer divisions sped toward Paris. In cities like Caen and Amiens, Wehrmacht soldiers occupied familiar cafes, walked cobblestone streets, and posted a watch on bridges spanning rivers like the Seine or the Meuse. The enemy was known: French, British, and later Americans, and while deadly, the conflict still fit within the rules and rhythms of civilized warfare. But in June 1941, with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, everything changed. Germany crossed into a war of annihilation. The Eastern Front swallowed entire armies whole, reducing entire divisions to whispers. The Wehrmacht sent over 3 million soldiers into the Soviet Union in the opening phase of the invasion, the largest land invasion in human history. The front line stretched across 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Within weeks, they captured vast territories: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, but at a staggering human cost. This wasn't like Belgium or northern France. This was the Bloodlands, as historian Timothy Snyder called them, a landscape where Nazi ideology turned military objectives into racial extermination campaigns. Wehrmacht soldiers burned villages to the ground under scorched earth directives. Civilians, namely Jews, partisans, and Slavs, were marked as obstacles to be erased. Behind the front lines, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS killing squads, executed over 1 million civilians during the initial phase of the invasion. And the conditions were just as merciless as the orders. Infantryman Herbert Biedermann, entrenched southeast of Leningrad in November of 1942, recalled fighting not just the Red Army, but nature itself. More men now succumbed to frostbite and exposure than to enemy bullets. The cold had become our most persistent foe. In Russia, even the air could kill you. In the West, German soldiers dug into positions along the Atlantic Wall, awaiting the Allied onslaught. They faced modern armies, but also a war they could interpret through familiar lenses. Trenches in Normandy's Bocage, urban warfare in the streets of Metz or Caen, tank battles on the outskirts of Paris. Even after the D-Day landings in June 1944, the battlefields resembled old world campaigns with defensive lines, formal surrenders, and prisoner exchanges. On the Eastern Front, no such order existed. In late 1941, during the Battle of Moscow, German soldiers froze outside the Soviet capital, their summer uniforms no match for temperatures that dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Hundreds died in their sleep from hypothermia. Lubricants in tanks and guns froze solid. Entire supply columns were wiped out by Soviet counterattacks or swallowed by blizzards. During the encirclement at Kiev, more than 600,000 Soviet troops were captured, but as winter set in, it was the Germans who found themselves starving, freezing, and fighting against a Red Army unwilling to break. By the time the Soviets launched their counter-offensive in December, German lines were shattered, retreating westward in disarray. Siegfried Knapper, a German artillery officer fighting in the west, reflected later, "In France, we still believed we could win, or at least survive honorably. We respected the Americans. It felt like the old wars, two professional armies facing off." But in the east, it was chaos. Soldiers scrawled desperate letters home describing frozen comrades and the stench of death lingering in the wind. Günther Koschorek, stationed outside Stalingrad, later wrote, "We saw whole battalions vanish overnight. Some froze where they stood, rifles still slung over their shoulders." By December 1941, two soldiers wearing the same field grey uniform could hardly comprehend what the other was enduring. One spent his night sheltering in the ruins of a French farmhouse, dodging Allied air patrols. The other huddled in a shallow trench outside Moscow, gnawing on frozen rations, knowing that frostbite or a Soviet counterattack could end him before the sun rose. This was the split. A war of strategy in the west, a war of survival in the east, and by the end of that first brutal winter, both men might as well have been fighting on different planets. A soldier's first enemy is often the one beneath his feet. For the German soldier in the west, war was waged within walls, behind hedgerows, down ruined alleyways, through the tight corners of Europe's old towns and farmland. In Normandy, they fought through the bocage, the infamous patchwork of dense hedges and narrow lanes that turned every field into a fortress. Ambushes waited behind every bend, machine guns hid in the green. A man could fight for weeks and never see more than the next hedgerow or the inside of a crumbling farmhouse. In these suffocating battlefields, artillery became claustrophobic. The whine of British or American shells echoed off stone walls and rolled through fog-choked villages. Shellfire could collapse entire streets in minutes. Yet, even here, the land itself provided pockets of shelter, cellars, ruins, and the thick woods to retreat into when the sky rained metal. One soldier recalled, "In Normandy, you didn't just fight forward, you fought sideways, behind, and below." But for the German soldier in the east, there were no walls, no hedgerows, no tight alleyways to take cover in. Out there, it was just the wind and the void. The Russian steppe stretched for miles in every direction, flat, open, and merciless. The muddy tracks turned to lakes during the spring thaw, immobilizing trucks and tanks alike. Then the dust followed in summer, choking lungs and machinery in equal measure. And when winter came, it fell like a hammer. Ice sealed rivers and froze men where they stood. Winds howled across empty plains, erasing footprints, blinding sentries, and leaving entire units disoriented and exposed. Hans Roth wrote, "We would march for days under skies that never ended, through snowdrifts up to our waists, praying for even a single farmhouse to break the horizon." The conditions on the Eastern Front didn't just make combat harder, they made survival harder. Ammunition froze, boots tore apart in slush and ice, and men slept on frozen ground that leached the warmth out of their bodies hour by hour. A broken leg in France meant evacuation to a field hospital, while a broken leg on the steppe meant freezing to death alone in the dark. In the West, German troops fought bitter, grueling house-to-house battles in places like Aachen and Metz, cities reduced to rubble but still offering stairwells to hide behind, sewers to move through, and basements to fortify. Even amid the carnage, the Western soldier could recognize something familiar in the towns and landscapes: farmhouses, Gothic churches, roadside inns, echoes of home. But in the East, the villages were few and far between. Those that hadn't already been burned to the ground often stood abandoned, doorless, and looted, as if the war itself had passed through like a storm. The lucky ones found a barn to shelter in. The unlucky ones dug into the frozen earth, only to be shelled the next morning. In France, a soldier might scramble across wet fields, dart between houses, or reinforce a battered strongpoint. In Russia, he dug shallow graves to sleep in, hoping the soil would shield him from Soviet mortars. There was no structure, no terrain to guide movements. The steppe was indifferent. In the Ardennes, Western soldiers shivered in forests where pine trees provided some cover from the elements, but in the east, the winds stripped men bare. The sky itself seemed endless and predatory. The land became an opponent. In the west, it boxed you in, and in the east, it left you utterly exposed. For both soldiers, the terrain defined how they fought and how they survived, but while the soldier in the west might curse the mud beneath his boots, the soldier in the east wondered if the earth itself had decided to bury him. War isn't fought with only bullets. It's fought in the minds of the men who stare across the no man's land at their enemies. And for those two German soldiers, the faces they saw, the enemies they learned to fear, shaped their wars as much as the terrain ever did. For the soldier facing the Americans or the British, there was still an old world familiarity to the enemy. These were men in clean pressed uniforms, with insignia not so different from his own. They marched in step, fought with discipline, and spoke languages he might have learned in school or overheard in the towns of occupied France. The Western Allies, professional, methodical, and at times even restrained, fought a war that still carried echoes of military codes of conduct. During the fighting in Normandy, some German soldiers reported moments where enemy fire slackened just long enough for medics on both sides to pull the wounded to safety. In North Africa, captured Afrika Korps soldiers noted that British and Commonwealth forces often treated them with a strange mix of respect and rivalry, even calling Rommel the Desert Fox with admiration. In surrender, there was structure. In defeat, there were rules. A soldier in France could expect to be processed, counted, and sent to a camp where meals, however meager, still arrived regularly. In contrast, on the Eastern Front, the word surrender rarely carried any guarantees. The German soldier in Russia was locked in a different war. The Red Army didn't fight for honor or flags, they fought to reclaim their homes, to avenge entire cities razed and villages wiped out by the invaders. There was no emotional buffer. For many Soviets, it was personal, and it showed. During the Battle of Stalingrad, entire German units went missing after Soviet breakthroughs. Survivors later reported mass executions of prisoners. German officers were often singled out and shot immediately. Even outside of major battles, Wehrmacht patrols who fell into partisan ambushes were rarely taken alive. Soviet partisans frequently left captured Germans hanging from trees as warnings to advancing columns. In Russia, partisan warfare blurred all lines of engagement. Soviet civilians who smiled at Germans by day could return at night with Molotov cocktails or knives. German counterinsurgency campaigns often responded with reprisals, burning entire villages or executing hostages, deepening the cycle of violence. A German machine gunner stationed near Smolensk wrote bitterly in his diary, "You stopped seeing soldiers. You started seeing shadows. Every forest we passed whispered death." In the West, however, there were strange flashes of shared humanity even amid the carnage. American soldiers who captured German troops during the Battle of the Bulge often shared rations, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, before sending them to the rear. There's reports of Wehrmacht prisoners chatting with GIs about jazz music, sports, and family life back home. In the West, flashes of professional courtesy sometimes broke through the carnage. One example is 18-year-old private Günther Grauwe, captured in Normandy in August 1944 and shipped to a US POW camp at Fort Lewis, Washington. Remembering the camp decades later, he wrote, "I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one." Grauwe recalled being able to buy ice cream and Coca-Cola with his camp pay and never going hungry, privileges unimaginable on the Eastern Front. The British sometimes went even further. After the Second Battle of El Alamein, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery invited the captured Panzer General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma to dinner in his desert caravan. News of the gesture reached London, prompting Winston Churchill's wry comment to the House of Commons. "Poor von Thoma, I too have dined with Montgomery." Such moments didn't erase the brutality of the war, but they reminded victors and captives alike, at least on the Western Front, mutual respect could briefly temper the hard edge of combat. But in the East, the bond of soldier to soldier didn't exist. When Soviet troops took German positions, prisoners were rarely taken. When they were, many were marched to improvised holding areas where conditions were so severe that men froze or starved within days. The Red Army operated under no illusions. Soviet soldiers had witnessed the atrocities in places like Babi Yar, where more than 30,000 Jewish civilians had been massacred by German forces and collaborators. By the time they crossed into German-held territory, revenge coursed through every rifle shot. A Soviet officer wrote after the liberation of Belarus, "There is no quarter, no pity. We lost our families, we bury our own, then bury them." For the German soldier on the Eastern Front, capture was a fate to be feared more than death in combat. In the West, a German might fear capture as a blow to his honor. In the East, it meant slow starvation or a frozen grave behind the barbed wire of a Soviet labor camp. Two enemies, two wars, and two entirely different psychological realities. One soldier returned home remembering the American corporal who tossed him a ration bar and offered him a cigarette. The other returned haunted by memories of Soviet troops advancing through smoke and snow, bayonets fixed, eyes empty. And while both carried the weight of war, only one truly knew what it meant to stare into the abyss of total vengeance. For the German soldier who surrendered on the Western Front, capture was often a door to survival, and for some, even an unexpected ticket to a strange kind of safety. Many were processed in France or Belgium before being shipped across the Channel to Britain or across the Atlantic to the United States and Canada. There, they found themselves in vast POW camps, but also in environments that, compared to the devastation of Europe, felt oddly calm, even eerily normal. In the UK and the US, camps were often spread across farmland, forests, or countryside. Some German prisoners were put to work harvesting crops or repairing infrastructure. Others found themselves near small American towns, allowed to walk under guard, to work details, or mingle with the locals, earning a reputation for being orderly and industrious. Some POWs even ended up staying in North America after the war. Thousands of former German soldiers, having experienced Allied POW camps, chose not to return to bombed-out Germany. They married locals, found jobs, and quietly became part of the fabric of post-war American or Canadian society. But perhaps the most surreal experience was reserved for some of the German officer class. As we've explored in an earlier video, the British detained high-ranking Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe officers at Trent Park, a lavish Georgian mansion turned into a POW camp just outside London. There, these officers lived comfortably, served full meals, provided with wine, access to gardens and libraries. They played cards, listened to classical music, and wandered the grounds freely. What they didn't know was that the British were listening. The entire house was bugged with hidden microphones. As the German officers relaxed and gossiped about campaigns, war crimes, and Hitler's leadership, British intelligence quietly gathered a trove of information. While soldiers on the Eastern Front were freezing to death in boxcars or toiling in Soviet labor camps, their counterparts in places like Trent Park were sipping tea in English gardens, and some didn't even realize how generous their captors were compared to the fate waiting for their comrades in the East. For the average enlisted POW in Britain or America, the days still blurred together. There were barbed wire fences, occasional punishment for unruly prisoners, and the ever-present humiliation of defeat. But there was also structure, food, and, crucially, a clear endpoint. By the end of the late 1940s, most Western POWs had returned home or chosen to stay abroad. William Lubeck described Western captivity as strange, almost dreamlike, after the front lines. The war was over, yet we woke to birdsong and hot meals. We couldn't reconcile it with what we'd left behind in France. But 1,000 miles east, surrender was no respite. It was the start of another war. For the Eastern Front soldier, capture by the Red Army was a sentence rarely survived. On the battlefield, surrender could mean immediate execution, especially in the heat of battle. If they survived the initial chaos, German prisoners were forced onto death marches. Tens of thousands were marched hundreds of kilometers into the Soviet interior, often without proper clothing or food. Those who collapsed were left behind or shot where they fell. By the time they reached their destination, one of Stalin's infamous gulags, the men were already skeletal. Inside the camps, conditions defied the imagination. The barracks were crude huts with broken windows, no insulation, and bunks packed so tightly that sickness moved through the population like fire. There was no real medical care, no warmth. Rations consisted of thin cabbage soup, scraps of black bread, and sometimes nothing at all. A former POW remembered, "We burned lice-ridden straw to keep warm, but it choked us with smoke. Still, it was better than freezing." Labor was relentless. Men hauled logs through the snow, dug canals with bare hands, or worked in mines where cave-ins were common. Beatings were frequent. The guards, many of them survivors of German atrocities on Soviet soil, treated their captors with undisguised hatred. Disease swept through the camps unchecked, and death became routine. Of the 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, it's estimated that 1.1 million never came back. Those who did return did so slowly, in waves, often 7, 8, even 10 years after the war had ended. When these gaunt figures finally set foot in Germany again, they were stepping into a world that had moved on without them. Back home, their comrades from the Western Front had already resumed civilian life. Many had found jobs, married, and started rebuilding West Germany during the so-called economic miracle. Some ran businesses, others became part of the Bundeswehr, the new West German military. They were moving forward. But the Eastern Front survivor, newly freed from years of forced labor, stood on unfamiliar streets, often with no family waiting. Their psychological scars were deeper, their physical health worse, and their cultural disconnect overwhelming. They were often alienated, seen as relics of a war no one wanted to talk about anymore. In many cases, they struggled to find work, fit in, or even tell their stories as post-war Germany tried to forget the horrors of the past. Even within veterans groups, the rift remained. The Western Front soldiers swapped stories of POW camps where they played football or bartered cigarettes with American guards. The Eastern Front veterans sat silent, unable or unwilling to describe what they'd endured. One soldier returned from Soviet captivity in 1955 and later wrote, "The West had grown soft in my absence. I saw no comrades, only strangers who couldn't understand where I had been." This was more than just a gap in time. It was a gap in trauma, in memory, in how these men now saw the world around them. One might joke about American rations or Allied air raids. The other had only the cold silence of a Siberian prison. Same war, same side, but by now they spoke entirely different emotional languages. For most German soldiers, surrender meant survival, but for the men of the Waffen-SS, surrender often meant a reckoning. Unlike their Wehrmacht counterparts, who could at least cling to the conversations of soldiering, SS troops carried the stain of ideological warfare wherever they went. They weren't just soldiers, they were Hitler's political stormtroopers, hand-picked to enforce the Third Reich's racial terror across Europe. When they finally laid down their arms, no one was offering cigarettes or handshakes. In the West, the Allies knew exactly who they were dealing with. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, where over 600 French civilians were butchered, and the murder of 84 unarmed American prisoners at Malmedy were only two examples on a long list of SS atrocities. These were men who had earned their black insignia by fighting as much with fire and rope as they did with rifles. The results? There were no illusions when SS men were captured by the Americans or British. They were separated from Wehrmacht prisoners, often roughed up, interrogated without patience, and marked as different. Some Western Allied troops didn't bother with formalities. They made their disgust clear, whether through the muzzle of a rifle or the back of a clenched fist. One Allied veteran remembered seeing captured SS men forced to dig graves, not for themselves, but for the civilians they had slaughtered. They weren't prisoners, he later wrote. They were a message. But if the West showed contempt, the East showed fury. To the Soviets, the Waffen-SS weren't just soldiers, they were architects of genocide. These were the men who'd spearheaded the burning of villages across Ukraine and Belarus, who had left mass graves filled with partisans, Jews, and entire families in their wake. There was no paperwork, no POW protocols when SS men fell into Red Army hands. In Belarus, SS prisoners were often stripped and executed within hours of capture, their corpses left as warnings. For Soviet units advancing through the ruins of towns like Vitebsk or Kharkiv, the black-collar tabs of the SS were seen as an invitation, not for negotiation but for retribution. One Soviet officer, witnessing the aftermath of an SS massacre in a Ukrainian village, summed up the sentiment. "We buried the children, then we buried the SS." Those few SS men who did make it into captivity faced a living death in the gulags. Beaten, starved, and given the worst labor assignments, they were treated as war criminals long before the term was formalized at Nuremberg. Even other German POWs viewed them with suspicion. On the long marches east, Wehrmacht prisoners distanced themselves from the SS, knowing full well what might happen if the Soviets couldn't tell them apart. For the Waffen-SS, there was no honor in surrender, no fraternity with their fellow soldiers, no sympathetic captors. Their war didn't end when they dropped their weapons. For many, it ended at the end of a Soviet rifle. For others, under the crushing weight of Siberian frost. When the war ended, neither man returned to the Germany they'd left behind. For the Western Front soldier, coming home meant stepping into a fractured but recovering West Germany, a place battered by bombing raids but already showing signs of life. By the late 1940s, the western zones of occupation, controlled by the United States, Britain, and France, were quietly stitching themselves back together. There were markets again, there were jobs, or at least the hope of them. For many, the Allied occupation, while humiliating at first, soon transformed into the foundation of a rebuilding process. The American presence brought with it the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars poured into shattered cities and factories, kickstarting what would become the Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle. Returning POWs, especially those who'd been in Allied camps, found themselves able to blend back into civilian life despite the rubble. The men who'd fought in France or Italy or surrendered to the Americans often had a clearer path forward. They returned home earlier, many by 1947 or 1948, and found that their country, for all its wounds, was beginning to breathe again. Some resumed family lives. Some opened businesses with American-supplied credit. Some even found their former enemies now providing rations and rebuilding infrastructure. It was disorienting, but for many Western Front veterans, it was manageable. But for the Eastern Front soldier, particularly the one captured by the Soviets and released a decade later, Germany was a stranger. Many returned to the eastern zones of occupation, the Soviet-controlled GDR, East Germany. Here, there was no Marshall Plan, there was no economic miracle. The Soviets, suspicious and intent on preventing the rise of another militarized Germany, dismantled factories, seized assets, and kept the population under tight control. For those who returned to East Germany, the war had been replaced with another form of struggle, one of ideology, surveillance, and fear. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, kept an eye on everyone, particularly former Wehrmacht soldiers. Veterans were often labeled as fascists, lumped into the same category as Nazi Party loyalists, even if they had fought as ordinary grunts. The trauma of Soviet captivity was compounded by life under the GDR's authoritarian regime. Men who'd survived Siberian gulags now faced interrogations in dimly lit basements back home as the East German state attempted to cleanse itself of any trace of reactionary elements. Meanwhile, those who returned to West Germany found a society rapidly rebranding itself. In the West, returning veterans were often seen as fellow victims of Hitler's madness or as pragmatic men who had done their duty. In East Germany, the state pushed a different narrative. Veterans were seen as remnants of a discredited fascist order. The official stance was that only communists had truly resisted Hitler. Everyone else, especially soldiers, bore guilt. This made it nearly impossible for an Eastern Front veteran living in the GDR to share his experience openly. In the East, former Wehrmacht soldiers were often forced into silence viewed with suspicion, or pressured to join socialist organizations just to survive under the regime. Even in West Germany, though more forgiving, differences lingered. The man who had returned in 47 from an American-run POW camp, healthy, connected, perhaps even employed, could barely relate to the hollow-eyed comrade who limped into town 8 years later from a Soviet labor camp. In veteran circles, the divide was palpable. One spoke of Allied bombing raids, advancing Shermans, and cold but organized POW camps. The other held back the stories of frostbitten feet, partisan ambushes, and the slow death marches eastward. One man re-entered society on the mend, the other found himself in a police state. Both had fought for the same country, both wore the same uniform, but in post-war Germany, their paths split once again. This time, not across battlefields, but across borders, ideologies, and two competing visions of what Germany would become. Years passed. Germany rose from the rubble, skylines changed, economies rebounded. Yet, across pub tales, family dinners, and veterans gatherings, these two soldiers remained separated by something invisible, a war that never ended between them. For the man who fought in the West, time dulled the sharpest edges. His memories were marked by battle, yes, but also by a sense of conclusion. He could speak about it, even if only in fragments. The hedgerows of Normandy, the American tank divisions, the long months in Allied captivity, these were chapters that could be told. Stories with beginnings and endings, victories and defeats, and even the occasional black humor of a soldier's recollection. For the man who returned from the East, silence became his second skin. The trauma of watching comrades vanish in snowdrifts outside Stalingrad or wasting away in the gulags of Siberia wasn't something easily shared. Not in West Germany, where people wanted to look ahead, and not in East Germany, where the past could get you denounced. In both Germanys, these Eastern Front veterans often withdrew, carrying an internal war no one else could see. Some coped by burying themselves in labor, others in drink. A few wrote memoirs, cryptic, fragmented recollections of frozen landscapes and enemies who seemed more elemental than human. The divide wasn't about pride or cowardice. It wasn't about who suffered more. It was deeper, psychological, cultural, existential. The Western Front soldier could reconcile, at least partially, with the enemy. After all, many Germans now drove cars made by the Americans or shook hand with former British officers at official functions. West Germany's new democracy leaned toward reconciliation with the West. But for the Eastern Front soldier, the Red Army's vengeance, the mass graves, and the years spent forgotten behind Soviet wire left wounds that no treaty could close. And so, two men who might have served in the same Wehrmacht company, who might have toasted victory in 1940, sat across from one another years later as strangers. They spoke the same language, but they could no longer share the same war. One saw a campaign, the other an apocalypse. One remembered the war ending in a prisoner exchange or a guarded handshake. The other remembered it ending in the frozen pits outside Minsk or in the iron grip of a gulag gate slamming shut. They could nod, they could drink, but they could never fully understand. Because while their country had lost one war, they had each lived through two. Two men, one war, two different worlds. The Eastern Front and Western Front didn't just split Germany on a map. They split the hearts and minds of those who returned home wearing the same uniform. For some, the war ended in 1945. For others, it dragged on for years, in silence, in memories, in the long shadows of Soviet labor camps, or the uneasy quiet of a rebuilding West Germany. The trauma divide between these two soldiers was never spoken about in the open. No newspaper headline, no government document could capture it fully, but it was real. It lived in the pauses of conversation, in the stories left untold, in the gulf between shared experience and quiet isolation. And this divide wasn't unique to them. Across history, across nations, soldiers returning from different fronts, different wars, often struggle to recognize each other's ghosts. But what do you think? Can two people who wore the same uniform but lived through two different nightmares ever truly relate? Let us know in the comment section below, and let us know if you have any interesting and relevant stories you would like to share. We'd love to hear your thoughts. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.